Welcome to the Uncommon Area, where we're dedicated to reimagining HOAs. We provide board members and managers with the resources to create uncommon communities where residents love their HOA and truly love where they live. Welcome to the Uncommon Area. I am Matthew Holbrook, and this episode is all about HOA annual meetings and elections. And joining us for this episode is Lisa Schwartz from the Ballot Box. Lisa, thank you so much for being part of this. You have been doing annual meetings and elections for associations for quite a while now. Talk to me just for a minute about this is a very niche business. How did you get into doing this?
It is, yes. And thank you very much for the invite. I'm glad to be here. We've been doing elections exclusively for HOAs for 18 years. Coming up on July of this year will be our 18th anniversary.
How did you get into that? It is. HOAs in general are kind of a niche business, but then elections is even more so. So how do you get to that?
It seems like when you ask people just in general, like, oh, how did you get into the HOA business? People sort of fall into that. I know we've sort of discussed that in the industry for years.
Sure.
The election portion of that came about after I had been working as a manager and in the HOA business, providing services to the HOAs through the various means of management services and then through the developer services. So I worked for a management company for a number of years, a couple of different ones, and then an opportunity became available to work for one of the developers. And then it was interesting because they wanted a developer, they wanted a perspective to assist the developer with the management aspect for the HOAs because they were great at building homes, but then would struggle with the management of the actual home community because that was not their focus. And so that provided a great opportunity. And then the law changed in California with specific to elections, and that's where I was at the time. And so it became an opportunity to provide the services under the new law, the provisions that were being required.
Right.
And so that turned into, I was like, you know what, I can do this. And I launched a business, and with the help of my now husband at the time, and that was almost 18 years ago. It's crazy.
Well, good for you. Well, just out of curiosity, if you meet somebody in like a social setting and they say, Lisa, what do you do for a living?
I know.
How do you answer that?
That's interesting. I say, I work with HOAs. I provide election services so that when they elect the board of directors, I'm the disinterested party that conducts the election.
Okay.
And because HOAs are so much a part of mainstream and where people live today, so many of the people live in it. We have an HOA, or I'm on my board. Sometimes I hear that, And so it's a very simple description of what is sometimes a very complex job.
Yeah. Now I know that it varies quite a bit state to state as far as, maybe what the laws are. We've talked that California in particular might have a little bit more emphasis legally on what the obligations are. And so I know that affects what you do. How does the process start as far as where you're at for an election? What's kind of the first step that you're looking at?
Sure. Well, usually when we're contacted, it's because the association needs services, often because they know that they have a contentious vote that's coming up. Sometimes it's the election of directors and they already know that they have a number of candidates that are running. Perhaps there's already some questions about integrity or validity, who's going to be doing this. And so sometimes they get that early on, and then they say to themselves, they start talking management, say, we really should, for our own protection in many cases, from any accusations of any wrongdoing or malfeasance in any way, we should hire somebody to do this for us. Others, it's maybe because the vote itself is controversial or can be considered political. Perhaps it's a large special assessment, so it involves money. And if it passes, then the homeowners might be suspicious. Well, it passed because you finagled the ballots because you wanted it passed, or whatever those circumstances might come about. So we're usually contacted at the beginning, where sometimes they might be already aware of that and want help with those processes.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think, where are there opportunities for somebody to manipulate an election if they didn't have a third party? And so I would imagine certain ballots being lost would be probably the easiest and most common way that somebody could do that.
Sure. We hear things from some of our clients who are using us for the first time about what happened last time. That we'll have all the horror stories about, well, last time, this happened or that happened.
So what are some of those things?
Yeah,
that
some of
have
the
happened?
things. One of the most common is that the ballots were counted off site or not in the presence of the homeowners, which is certainly a California law. It's also a law for Nevada. I believe it's also the law in Texas. There's a couple of the, where they can't be done without the homeowners having the right to actually watch the tabulation and the opening. Others are things with regards to the access of ballots. So, for example, board members, incumbent directors, maybe they're running, were given access to blank ballots and envelopes where they were just provided, but then they were withheld from the challenger candidates. The other things would be they're provided with a list of members to the incumbent directors, but not to the challenger directors, or they got a list of all the people and who voted or whatever, and email addresses, and we weren't provided that. So sometimes it relates to the access that's provided. So it just depends.
Yeah, and it seems that there could be, especially in certain states where maybe the laws aren't as strong, incumbents maybe could get access to who's voting as the votes come in. And I could imagine they could then falsify some ballots on behalf of people who didn't vote and kind of stuff the ballot box in that way.
Especially if they have access to the blanks.
Yeah.
That would be the challenge. You'd have to have both parts, I think, because simply having access to know who's voted doesn't provide the access for tampering unless you also then have access to ballots that you could fill out for the people who hadn't voted yet.
So if somebody is using a third-party service to run an election, what do you do to kind of protect against those kinds of things? What keeps somebody from recreating a ballot, their own ballot, and then stuffing the ballot box?
Sure. One of the things that we do is we assign a unique identifier to each of the units, so that we can print those on the outer materials so that they're easily identifiable. We also use a business reply permit envelope, which allows for the homeowner to return the ballot without having to put their own stamp on it, and then is also difficult to duplicate. The return envelopes are pre-printed with the homeowner's information and the stuff that, so again, almost impossible to duplicate. And then our ballots are special size, they're special colors. And so we, again, would know all of those things put together that it's not our materials. We do occasionally have a ballot that gets put into another envelope and where they've tried to, and of course it gets opened with our regular mail because it's not ballot envelopes. And then we know, it's like, oh no, this is, so we know immediately that it is, and now it's spoiled because it's been opened, and then we have to try to notify the homeowner, hey, this isn't the proper way to vote, and try to get them the replacement materials. So we print those, we put ID numbers on them. They're a different special size, special color, and no one else has access to them without special permission. So if someone, say a board member, emails us and says, hey, I'm worried about getting quorum, which is oftentimes the reasoning behind why they would like to have access to those ballots. We're struggling. We want to get quorum. Please send me 20 ballots and envelopes. And our response is, no, we don't provide those. We are happy to provide individual replacements by mail to anyone who would request them from a, hey, the dog ate it. I didn't get it. It's got coffee spilled on it, whatever. But we're not going to provide it in mass in just blanks. So that almost eliminates the entirety of being able to falsify something. Now, there could be a circumstance where someone finds a ballot that was discarded by someone in the trash or something along those lines, and look, somebody threw their trash out, and they might have access to a ballot, maybe one or two ballots. But other than that, there would be no way to then be able to do that. So that's a couple of the things that we do.
Yeah. So one of the things, if I'm a board member listening to what you just said, or a homeowner, I'm going to be hearing, wait a minute. So Lisa knows exactly how I voted individually, right? Because you have the identifier on the ballot.
No, not on the ballot, only the return envelopes.
I see. So it's on the return envelope. So it still remains an anonymous vote.
Exactly. And we even get that question too with people who are trying to submit, say, a ballot in person at the meeting, and they only have the secret ballot envelope. And they say, oh, I thought I only needed the return envelope for if I was going to mail it.
Right.
And we do put that on the materials that even if you're going to drop it in person, it still has to be in both envelopes, because once you've opened the outer envelope, if the ballot was directly inside, then I could see who was voting and how they then voted. So the reason that it's in two envelopes is so that when the outer envelope is opened after you've identified who has voted, then the inner envelopes are then all in a big pile.
Got it.
Even I, as the inspector opening the envelopes, couldn't tell whose ballot was whose, because then the inner envelopes have no identification.
So that multiple envelope system, I believe, is codified in California.
Yes.
That's required.
It's required in a couple states. It's required in California. It's required in Nevada. And then we will use that system because it works so well for other states.
So that's what I was going to ask. You do the same thing even when it's not required.
Sometimes they'll ask for it. Sometimes they won't. So it just depends. But we try to do that for the other states as well.
Interesting.
The other states also many times don't have to use envelopes at all. They can vote electronically. So that's an option that's only recently been provided to both Nevada and California, where we primarily provide service, but it's been available for other states for much longer.
Yeah. So, well, you bring that up. I was going to get to that, but we might as well do it now. How does electronic voting change the whole thing for HOAs?
It really depends on the community, because some communities are entirely against the electronic voting for whatever reason. The most common reason I think we hear is, our homeowners are elderly and they don't really do email. We don't really do much email. You're not really very electronic. We don't even have a website. And so we hear that from some of our clients. Or there's a mistrust of the electronic system. We'd rather, we want it where we can see it. Or we don't collect that information. We have one that was specifically, they don't collect emails from their homeowners because they're worried in that when someone requests the list, then the email address is on the list and they don't want to be spammed, and so they don't even retain the homeowners' emails because they don't want them as part of their records. So it just really depends on the community, I think, as far as if they're interested in doing that, and changing that up.
So let me play out a hypothetical for a second, and I know this would never apply to you. So instead of Lisa, let's talk about Lucy from the election box.
Okay.
And let's say I'm a homeowner running for the board, and I really, really want to be on the board, and I contact Lucy and I say, I'm going to slip you $10,000 in exchange for X, Y, or Z. Is there anything that prevents an unethical inspector from swinging an election?
I suppose if you had someone who was a single entity, perhaps, someone who's just doing it themselves and they're saying, sure, I'll be your inspector of election, because the associations don't have to hire someone to do that. It can be a volunteer. You can get someone from, a friend of someone, you could get a notary. I know that's part of California's can be notaries, but they don't necessarily have to even have any specific knowledge with regards to HOA election processing or any of that. You could just say, hey, can you come and count our ballots? And so in that case, I suppose if you had somebody who was, that could be, I suppose anything's possible. Yeah. It is difficult to imagine that a professional service that you're hiring would be in any way incentivized to do that
based on their whole business.
Literally jeopardize your entire business. So you wouldn't be in business very long, because then of course I would think word would spread. Somebody would be bragging about, the fact that all you have to do is do this, and then, you could get this done the way you wanted it. But I suppose anything's
Could
possible.
some random notary, let's say in California where the laws are more complex, could they manage to run a successful election with the double ballot system and all the things that go into that?
That's the thing is while in California, the legislature has imposed the restrictions and the duties of the inspector of election, in many cases, all of those duties are not assigned to the inspector. A lot of times the management company will take on a lot of those actions, and then they'll say, for example, they've already gone through the candidate solicitation process, they've gone through the notice process, the ballots have been mailed, the ballots have come back, and then they'll say, can you please come and count these? So they'll limit the amount of authority or oversight to the inspector because they've done most of the work already. One of the things that sets us a little bit of apart is we take over a little bit more. Because the inspector of election has so much responsibility to ensure that the election process was conducted properly, and because some of the states have a very strict and very complex set of requirements, everything from timing as far as when notices have to go out to specific verbiages that need to be on the notices. It's hard to show up at the very end and then do this singular part, not knowing how the rest of the processes were conducted. And so I think what happens is the people that might be contacted at the very end to do those last minute or sort of very, very compartmentalized pieces, they don't realize the level of responsibility that is actually part of their duties. Because once you are the inspector of election, you are responsible for everything with regards to the election. And that's kind of hard to do when you're showing up at the last minute doing just a very small piece of that process. Yeah. So.
And you referred to the whole process. So, like with the service that you would provide, you generally send out the request for candidates as well? Or does that come
We can. Or at least if it's being done through the management company, then we're acknowledging the timing of those to make sure that the timing has been met, if there's specific requirements for their election rules that state certain things, that their notices are inclusive of those the specific verbiages and stuff. A lot of that gets missed. And so if we're not involved from the beginning, sometimes we'll find as we're reviewing things that things weren't done properly, and then we're like, you really have to, you should go back and do this again because it was done improperly. Yeah. So it's better to at least get them involved at the beginning so that even if we're not specifically doing that process, we're at least part of the oversight that goes through so that it is at least being done properly.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, then we get into the actual tabulation of votes. And I'm always, I have a vested interest in the voting being done efficiently. Mm-hmm. I have been in the past in meetings where there have been not the professionals counting the votes, and it's gone for large associations, could go until like 2:00 in the morning.
I've heard of those horror stories. Yeah.
And it's brutal. And so, one, I know you've developed processes to where it's very precise and you're able to tabulate the results reasonably quickly. I'm just curious, over 18 years, how has that evolved even for your own practices and finding ways to do that better?
We actually had started from the beginning with a type of electronic Scantron sort of a form, which we modified. It was a school sort of when you used to take the bubble tests, and we worked with the company who had provided those machines to schools, and we had them modify a machine, and we worked with them on the ballots. The challenge was that the ballots needed to be printed with a specific ink, so that they could be read by the machine, and that there was a limitation as to what could be put on the ballot. We have clients who can accumulate. We have clients who can't accumulate. Maybe they're electing 5, they're electing 3, they're electing 2, and they want to add things. They want to add the IRS. They want to add the minutes. So the configuration of the number of ballots that would need to be printed and ready and then be able to be utilized was not practical in that sense. So we quickly went to a a manual version that could be edited a little easier. Unfortunately, we can't scan them, and so we do use. I think the lengthiest part of the process, just overall, is the opening of the envelopes and pulling them, the first envelope out for the ones that have the double envelopes or requirement, and then taking the next envelope and then, opening those and then taking the ballots out. The actual tabulation and counting process is the fastest part of the process. So when people think about the tabulation or the opening, the ballot counting, the counting is actually not the longest part. It's the getting to that point so that you can count them.
You're actually sorting the ballots as you open them, aren't you?
Yes, to a certain extent, yeah. And one of the things that we've done and that we did from the very beginning was we did not want to use a full sheet ballot because the full sheet ballot would have to be, tri-folded, and then you could not use effectively a machine that would cut them open, because then they would cut the ballots in almost every single case. So then you're taping them back together, and that became very, very even worse than hand slitting them. So from the very beginning, we made our ballot 1/3 sheet of paper. So it was only the one section of that, and then that way we could quickly open the ballots with the machine and then pull the envelopes out. And in addition, they did not need to be unfolded. Sometimes you'd get, I could show you where they were folded into, little, and then it was like 15 folds. And then of course the piece of paper doesn't, you're trying to get these fold, and they would be piles, and you're trying to put things on. So just the logistics of the physical aspect of getting them out of the envelopes and getting them stacked was, a nightmare, trying to get those out. So we very quickly, immediately, we never even used a full sheet ballot, but we did that early on to ensure that we could very quickly take them, get them out of the envelopes and then sort them and stack them by similar voting patterns, and so once that's done, the tabulation goes very quickly. We do use an Excel spreadsheet so that we can, add those up very quickly, and then the ballots are numbered as they're tabulated, so that if we have 150 and we know we are supposed to have 150 envelopes, then by the time we get to the last ballot, it should be 150. It
better match.
Yeah, it should match. If not, then we have to go back. Did we leave an envelope? What happened? We do occasionally get an empty, so that we'll make a mental note or write on, empty envelope so that we know we're going to be one short. Sometimes there are miscellaneous pieces of paper in there instead of the ballot, and so
interesting.
It just depends on what comes in.
So I know that some associations are now conducting their whole election results by Zoom, and it's all online. And
thank you, COVID.
Yeah. So I was at a meeting where you were doing the election recently, and you actually put the spreadsheet up on the screen while you were counting. Do you get any negative feedback from people feeling like that's too much transparency and that you can see all the votes coming in?
We have had occasionally where I'll put that up and they're like, "Why are we seeing this? What is this? Why are we seeing this?" And I oftentimes don't even have to reply. There are other people on the screen. I was like, well, we want to see this. This is something that we want to be, it's actually funny because when we're there in person, what you see is, say it's me, I'm sitting at a table over on the side of the room, and I'm shuffling a bunch of paper that's pretty much all you see.
Yeah.
On the virtual platform, you're actually, my camera is above the table. You can actually see the envelopes. You can see me pulling all the ballots out, and then I display the tabulation on the screen. So it's actually, I think, more transparent virtually than
like watching you would think.
Race. Yeah, you would actually think it'd be opposite. And I think a lot of clients who insist on, oh no, we want you there in person, I think they miss out on what, the more of the what I feel is more transparency, because you can actually see me while I'm working.
Would you combine it? Would you do it in person but have a Zoom on a TV in the room that might show that screen as you're working on it?
Yeah, if the client provides those technical capabilities, it's not something that I provide to my employees to provide those things while they're traveling or while they show up. But if they're in their own work location and we're doing them virtually, then they have the they have the double cameras and they're all set up for that, but not to travel.
Yeah.
They'd have to have, their own internet source and the, Wi-Fi and that kind of stuff. and then to be able to provide something as a display, travels with some sort of zip up screen or something. It's not feasible, but there have been circumstances where we've been in a clubhouse and the client has a screen, they have a projector, and they'll ask, hey, can you hook this up to your laptop? And then that way we can display it here. Occasionally that happens. Absolutely happy to do that. Yeah. But it's not the norm.
Yeah.
Usually it's just a person sitting in the corner and, oh yeah, the ballot person's over there doing their thing. And that's fine. In many cases, they'll combine the board meeting with the annual meeting so that they're, both meetings are running concurrently. We're tabulating so that people aren't sort of sitting there doing nothing. They're, sort of making use of the time when there's the waiting around time,
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Well, just a couple of last questions for you. Cumulative voting, is that more common or less common?
It's more common.
The states.
Mm-hmm. It's most common. Yeah. I think it's standard corporate style voting. I know a lot of the HOAs, we forget that they're usually corporations.
Yeah.
And so if you own stock, and you get your ballot, and you get that from your Xerox or, we have stock in Harley Davidson. My husband loves that. And so he's had stock in Harley Davidson for, long since before I even met him. And so every year we get that little ticket, it says it's cumulative and it's a proxy vote. It's the way we used to do it, 30 years ago.
I bet you pay attention to that stuff more than most people.
It is
just for process.
It is interesting. Yeah. It's that what you focus on because of your specific, your job specialty.
Right.
Yeah.
So I know at least it used to be that somebody had to declare their intent to vote cumulatively. Yeah. Does that apply anywhere anymore? Is that completely done away with?
Yeah, it doesn't. Well, let's see. For the communities who are, if you're going to do a mailed ballot, that has to be done ahead of time, because what you can't do is you can't send out a ballot where you can't accumulate and then collect hundreds of them, get to the meeting and then say, does anybody want to accumulate?
Right.
And then nobody says anything, or and then somehow say, okay, well, or then they say, yeah, I'm going to, and then now you have hundreds of ballots where they didn't accumulate. Yeah. So that has to be done. But that provision was from the long ago process where you didn't get ballots ahead of time. The only way that you got a ballot was you showed up at the annual meeting. Otherwise, and the stock corporations that we get, that you get a proxy that says either, you hold on to that and you show up at the meeting and then they hand you a ballot, or the board president or the secretary, whoever's the proxy holder, they're going to cast your ballot at the meeting. That's how it used to be done.
Yeah.
And then further now, a lot of the corporations that are the HOAs, California, Nevada, some of the other ones, then they're actually doing mailed ballots. So then the proxies are very, very limited use now, because you have a ballot in your hand.
So for those who are watching this who aren't familiar with the term cumulative voting, can you give like a 20-second explanation as to what that's about?
Sure. Cumulative voting is being able to combine the total number of votes that you have based on the number of directors that are being elected, versus non-cumulative voting in that you can only cast one vote per candidate. Right. So if you're electing 3 directors and you can cumulate, you could take those 3 votes and cast them for all towards one, or split it 2 and 1. You can basically choose to pick how
one time for 3 candidates, or you can vote 3 for one, 2 for one, and 1 for another.
Exactly.
Anything that cumulates to 3.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Well, that's helpful. Last question I would have for you: if you were addressing managers and board members, what is it that you would want them most to know heading into an election? What should they be aware of, be thinking about, other than they should have a third party?
I would say that the process being provided by someone who, if there could be an assumption that they might have an interest in it, perhaps some oversight by someone who wouldn't have an interest in it. Not necessarily someone that you would have to pay, but someone who might be a little bit more disinterested than whoever might be in some way desiring of a specific outcome.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Well, Lisa, really appreciate you being part of this episode. Very helpful. And for those of you who are watching or listening, that's a wrap for this episode of The Uncommon Area. If you know anyone who would benefit from this podcast, we would love for you to share it with them. And if this podcast has been helpful for you, we would appreciate it if you would rate it and leave a review. That helps us to grow and to get the word out about the Uncommon Area. So we appreciate you tuning in, and I would encourage you to be on the lookout as additional episodes of the Uncommon Area come out.